In the very first chapter of the first book of the Old Testament, we see a plurality right from the start. We read in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, God says, "Let us," which is plural, "make man in our," which is plural, "image." And Scripture teaches that we are made in the image of God. So who is God talking to? Now, some have suggested that God is speaking to the angels, but we're not created in the image of God and the angels, only God's. So there must be a plurality within the Godhead. Now, we've already covered Genesis chapter 19, verse 24 earlier, but again, it's clear that there is one person of Yahweh on earth, raining brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from Yahweh out of the heavens. Now, notice here in Amos chapter 4 what Yahweh says about this event. Now, throughout chapter 4, it says at the end of each paragraph, it says Yahweh. So Yahweh is the one who's speaking. And throughout, Yahweh talks about things that he has done. So he says, "I have done this, and I have done that." And when we get to verse 10, notice that Yahweh says that he sent the plagues in Egypt, and he is the one who killed with a sword. Now, who is the one identified with the sword in the Old Testament? That's right, we've seen that it's the angel or messenger of Yahweh. Now, as we continue to read in verse 11, it says, "I overthrew some of you as God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah." So again, in Genesis chapter 19, it's Yahweh who overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. But here, Yahweh is speaking in the first person, calling someone else God, and identifying this person, who he calls God, as the one who overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah, who of course is Yahweh. So here is another example of two distinct persons, both being identified as Yahweh. And I want you to remember here that Yahweh calls this other person of Yahweh God. Now, this will become important when we get to the New Testament. Now, also in Genesis chapter 11, which we also covered earlier, is the building of the Tower of Babel. And Yahweh says, "Let us," which is plural, "go down and confuse their language." And 2 verses later, it says that only Yahweh confused their language. So again, there is clearly a plurality within the one being of Yahweh. Now, in the beginning of this video, we read Deuteronomy 6:4. It's known as the Shema. It says that Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one. And the Hebrew word translated as one here is the word echad. Now, most non-Trinitarians interpret this passage to mean that Yahweh is only one person. But as we take a closer look at how this Hebrew word is used throughout the Old Testament, this interpretation might not be valid. Now, to start off, when we take a look at this passage in its context, by looking at the surrounding passages and chapters, we see that there is no discussion of how many persons of Yahweh there are. What is being discussed is how Yahweh is the only God, and that he does not want his people to worship other false gods who do not exist. Now, we also see in these other Old Testament examples where this Hebrew word echad is being used, we see that this word can be used to describe the uniqueness of something. So in the context of this passage, what is being said here is that Yahweh our God, Yahweh is unique, that he is the only God, and we should not forget him and worship any other so-called gods. Now, you can see that the New Jewish Publication Society version translates Deuteronomy 6:4 as, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh alone." And I would also recommend that you read Dr. Michael Brown's book series, Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus. And he also has a 20-hour lecture where he discusses all this material and more on 10 DVDs available on his website. And I'll also give all of the study resource links at the end of this video. Now, if you still want to insist that the Hebrew word here means that Yahweh is only one person, you have to admit to the fact that the nation of Israel was under the impression that there was more than one person of Yahweh. However, when we take another look at where and how this Hebrew word is used in the Old Testament, we see that it is also used to indicate a compound unity. Now, a good place to start is to find out where this Hebrew word is first used. And we see that it's actually used here in Genesis chapter 1, verse 5, where both evening and morning are called the first day, or day 1. And the next place the same Hebrew word appears is in chapter 2. Here you have two distinct persons, Adam and Eve, being called one flesh. And these are just two examples of how this Hebrew word is used when describing multiple distinct things, yet also being described as one. Exactly what the word Trinity means, triunity, or three in one. So the idea and the concept of a plurality within one is clearly taught from the first chapters of Genesis. And since the Bible teaches that there are plurality within the Godhead, the Trinitarian position is consistent with both teachings of the Old and New Testament, that there is only one God, yet three distinct persons. Okay, now that we've gone through the Old Testament and established that there is a plurality of persons within the one God Yahweh, let's go ahead and take a look at the early ancient Jewish understanding of God to see what they believe and understood from the scriptures. Now we'll be taking a look at a time hundreds of years before the incarnation, so this is not some Christian view or influence. Now during the time of the Second Temple period, or the time between the writing of the Old and New Testament, the Jews translated the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic. Now this is known as the Targum. Now they also translated it into Greek, known as the Septuagint. Now remember, these are translations of the Hebrew Bible by Jewish rabbis. Now in the Targum, we read about the Memra of the Lord, or the Memra of Yahweh. Now the word Memra is the Aramaic word for word. So instead of reading the word of Yahweh, it would be the Memra of Yahweh. Just like the Greek word for word is logos, which we'll cover when we get to the Gospel of John, which was written in Greek. Now what's interesting about the Targum is how the Jews who translated the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic understood some of these passages in the Old Testament that we've covered. Now let's go ahead and take a look at a few of these to get a better understanding of the Jewish mindset back then, which then leads up to the time of the writing of the New Testament in the first century. Okay, in the Old Testament, we see in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, it says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." But you can see that the Targum translates it as, "The Memra of Yahweh created man in his likeness." And in Genesis chapter 3, verse 8, that they heard the sound of Yahweh God walking in the garden. And we can see that the Jewish translators translate it as, "and they heard the voice of the Memra," or the word of Yahweh walking, clearly identifying the person of Yahweh as the word of Yahweh. And in Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, "And he believed in Yahweh, and he accounted it to him for righteousness." But we can see that the Jewish translators translate it as, that Abraham trusted in the Memra, or the word of Yahweh. And in Genesis chapter 17, we see that it says, "And I will establish my covenant between me and you." And we can see that the Targum translates it as, "And I will establish my covenant between my Memra, or word, and between you." And in Genesis chapter 18, which we looked at, it says that Yahweh appeared to him. We can see that the Targum translates it as the word, or Memra, of Yahweh appeared to him. And finally, we'll just look at another one in Genesis chapter 19, verse 24. It says that Yahweh rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from Yahweh out of the heavens. Now notice that the Targum translates it as, "Then the Memra, or word of Yahweh, rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from Yahweh out of the heavens." Now we could go through example after example like this, where they insert the Memra of Yahweh in places where just Yahweh appears. And the Jewish translators understood that there was a plurality within the Godhead. Now this was the understanding of the Jewish people up until the 2nd century BC. Now for more information on this, I would recommend a book by Jewish scholar Alan Siegel called "The Two Powers in Heaven." Although as a modern Jew, he believes that this view is heresy, but does admit to the fact that this was the belief of the ancient Jews. Or I'd recommend watching this video presentation by Dr. Michael Heiser with the same title. And in this video, he goes through not only the Targum, but a lot of other ancient Jewish writings to prove that they believed in a plurality within the Godhead, hundreds of years before Christianity came onto the scene. Now remember, I'll go ahead and post these links at the end of this video. Now here in this section, we will first take a look in the Old Testament passages that talk about the creation of the heavens and the earth and all things in them. Now we'll start out by reading Job chapter 38, verse 4, where Yahweh asked Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding." Now Yahweh tells Job that he is the one who laid the foundations of the earth. And Yahweh then goes on to ask him where he was when he created different things, referring back to the creation week in Genesis chapter 1. Now in Psalms 104, the entire chapter talks about how it was Yahweh that created everything, and again, clearly using the language of Genesis. Now notice that it is Yahweh that stretches out the heavens and laid the foundations of the earth. And throughout the rest of the chapter, it continually states that all these things that were created are the works of Him. Now Nehemiah 9 is a great chapter to read through completely. Here in verse 6, we see that it is Yahweh who made the heaven, the earth, and everything on it. And it's a great read because it describes the interactions that Yahweh had between Abraham, Moses, and what he did through the Exodus, which we covered earlier. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the book of Isaiah. And I would strongly recommend that everyone go ahead and read Isaiah's chapters 40 through at least chapter 53. Now in these chapters, Yahweh is clear that He is the only God, which we read at the beginning of this video. Now He is the creator, and He sets Himself up against everyone, including false idols and false gods, because He alone is the only God, the eternal creator, which again makes more sense in the context of Deuteronomy 6:4, the Shema. In Isaiah chapter 40, we read in verses 21 and 22 that it is Yahweh who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. And we continue to read down to verse 28, and Yahweh says that He is the everlasting God, Yahweh, the creator of the ends of the earth. As you can see, it is Yahweh who is the everlasting God, the creator. And here in chapter 42, it says, "Thus says God Yahweh, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread forth the earth and that which comes from it, who gives breath to people on it, and spirit to those who walk on it." And in chapter 44, we read, "Thus says Yahweh, your Redeemer, and He who formed you from the womb. I am Yahweh who makes all things, who stretches out the heavens all alone, who spreads abroad the earth by myself." Now as you can see, it is Yahweh who makes all things and stretched out the heavens all alone. And by myself, He states that He did these things. Now notice it is only Yahweh all alone by Himself. And in chapter 45, Yahweh states, "I have made the earth, and I created man on it. My hands stretched out the heavens, and all of their hosts I have commanded." Now notice that it is Yahweh and Yahweh alone who is the creator. And He has done these things by His hands. He has commanded these things. And in chapter 48, Yahweh says in verse 12, "Listen to me, O Jacob and Israel, my called. I am He. I am the first, and I am also the last. Indeed, my hands laid the foundations of the earth, and my right hand has stretched out the heavens." Now in chapter 51, we again read, "And you forget Yahweh your Maker, who stretched out the heavens and laid the foundations of the earth." I think that Yahweh has been pretty clear to let us know that it was Him and Him alone who created the heavens and the earth and all things in them. So in conclusion, we see that number one, Yahweh tells us that He is the only God, and besides Him there were no gods that were formed, nor will there ever be. And this again refutes polytheism, the view that there are many gods, the view of Hinduism and Mormonism. Now 2, Yahweh laid the foundations of the earth and stretched out the heavens. And 3, Yahweh created everything all alone, by his hands. Now this refutes the teachings of the Jehovah's Witnesses that Jehovah created Michael the archangel, and through Michael, he created all other things. Okay, now that we've covered the Old Testament and the ancient Jewish understanding that there is a plurality within the Godhead, let's go ahead and take a look at the New Testament to see what it has to say about who is the creator of all things.